All right, imagine for a second a massive, highly efficient global food system that just vanished, seemingly wiped from the historical record without a trace. We're talking about a body of knowledge so ancient and honestly so incredibly effective that its disappearance should really be considered one of the most significant events in all of human history. So let's dive right into this explainer. The source material we're analyzing today asks us to basically reconsider everything we think we know about human agriculture. You know the usual story, right? A straight, linear march from primitive foraging all the way to modern farming. Well, instead of that, we're going to look at some fascinating physical and archival evidence of something entirely different: global food forests.
And the whole thing really hinges on this central, kind of haunting question. Why, in virtually every corner of the world, at virtually the exact same moment in history, did humanity just abandon the most efficient food system ever devised? And not only abandon it, but then spend the next 2 centuries pretending it never even existed. It points to altered maps, cleared forests, and just an almost total erasure of a completely decentralized way of living. And here's the kicker. This wasn't some slow, gradual transition triggered by a natural climate shift. No, this erasure happened in a strikingly compressed window of time.
But the early archival clues, they're actually hiding right there in plain sight. When you dig into botanical survey reports from the early 1800s, colonial surveyors were repeatedly describing forests that seemed to feed people systematically and purposefully. Take this one quote from a British surveyor on the Dean Plateau back in 1817. He's walking through a forest with a level of biological engineering he literally has no framework to understand, and he writes down that it's an arrangement of trees so convenient that one begins to suspect the hand of man. I mean, just think about how much effort it takes for us to keep a single backyard tomato plant alive today. And here this guy was, staring at a massive, heavily managed, multi-layered, multi-species food production system that basically just ran itself.
And get this, it wasn't just happening in England. A French naturalist on an entirely different continent, writing from deep in the interior of the Congo in 1832, documented the exact same phenomenon. He specifically noted an almost impossible abundance of fruit, nut, and medicinal plants arranged in an order that no accident of nature could produce. It is absolutely astonishing. You have an English surveyor and a French naturalist, completely different continents, totally different ecosystems, operating decades apart, and they are using nearly identical language to describe highly engineered food forests.
A quarter to a third. That is a massive chunk of land. But according to the Doomsday Book of 1086 and a bunch of subsequent surveys, that's exactly how much of Norman England was covered by royal forests. Now, the standard historical explanation usually tells us, oh, these were just hunting grounds for aristocratic privilege, nothing to see here. But the source material points out something crucial. The incredibly severe laws protecting those forests were actually designed to prevent you from clearing land, farming, or even taking timber. What were they protecting? The mast. Stuff like acorns, beechnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts. These were not just hunting playgrounds. They were heavily protected, actively managed food systems that sustained rural populations for thousands of years. Let's jump over to North America, where the confusion from early colonial observers absolutely continued. They described the continent as looking park-like, almost as if someone had specifically designed it. And, well, someone had. The Kalapuya in the Willamette Valley used precise, highly coordinated burning cycles for camas bulbs. You had the Haudenosaunee Confederacy practicing landscape-scale companion planting right alongside expansive food forests, and down in the Carolina Piedmont in the late 1600s, a British administrator actually described the land as being so perfectly tended that an Englishman might mistake it for an orchard of great age. These were deeply integrated generational food forests maintained for centuries.
Okay, now this brings us to the Amazon, and this is where this hidden history gets incredibly difficult to dismiss. For the longest time, we were taught that the Amazon was this pristine, untouched wild jungle. But starting in the 1990s, researchers really started studying terra preta, or dark earth, and it's wild. Unlike the natural, highly weathered red clay of the region, terra preta is a deliberately manufactured, engineered soil. It's packed with charred organic matter, bone, and ceramics, and it covers potentially hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Crucially, wherever you find this engineered soil, you find these anomalous, massive concentrations of human-sustaining species, things like Brazil nut, cacao, and acai. Plant life that simply does not occur naturally in such high, incredibly convenient densities. It is literal ground-level evidence of an engineered food system operating at a continental scale.
But hands down, the most staggering piece of this whole puzzle is the timeline. We are looking at what's called a global erasure window. Across England in the 1750s, the Enclosure Acts dismantled the common food forests, fencing them off for agricultural monoculture.
By the 1780s in North America, the clearing of indigenous food systems aggressively accelerates. Move to the 1820s in West Africa, and ancient multi-species sacred groves are being systematically dismantled. Then by the 1850s in Asia, colonial administrations completely criminalize common forest use. We are talking about the sudden, systematic destruction of deeply rooted agriculture across totally different continents, empires, and ecosystems, all in a remarkably narrow window of just a few decades.
Which really brings us to a massive coordination problem, right? Like, how in the world did competing empires that spoke different languages and had completely different legal traditions, manage to implement virtually identical policies regarding forest clearance in virtually identical timeframes across 6 different continents? The source makes a really compelling argument here. This scale, this speed, and this universality completely defies standard historical explanations of mere coincidence. The official framework of history just simply cannot resolve how or why the synchronized clearing happens so incredibly fast all over the globe. To truly understand what was lost during this very sudden erasure, you have to think about the timeline of these trees. A pecan tree? That takes 25 years to reach full food production. A chestnut takes 40 years. An oak tree can take up to 100 years before it produces any significant mast. The point is, you don't plant a food forest for yourself. You plant it for your grandchildren. It requires this incredibly deep generational knowledge. It exists purely in the relationship between a community and a landscape over lifetimes. So when a community is suddenly displaced, dispersed, or destroyed, that knowledge doesn't just slowly fade away. It breaks catastrophically. And it breaks permanently. And there's this bizarre little paradox from this exact same time period that the source points out. Right as all this clearing is happening, a world-spanning network of botanical gardens springs up, places like Kew Gardens and the Missouri Botanical Garden. But pay super close attention to what they chose to save versus what was lost. They painstakingly preserve the individual plant specimens, the scientific classifications, the physical parts, but they completely discarded the living instructions. They tossed out all the landscape-scale polyculture knowledge of how to actually use these plants collectively as a self-sustaining food system for human sovereignty. Basically, they saved all the parts, but they purposefully threw away the instruction manual. We can really see the echoes of this tragedy in a single, devastating number: 4 billion. This is the story of the American chestnut, which was arguably the single most important food tree in eastern North America. It literally represented about a quarter of all trees in the eastern deciduous forest. It provided massive amounts of highly nutritious, completely free food to every human and animal in its range, with absolutely zero human input required. But then, starting in 1904, a fungal blight entered the population. By 1940, 4 billion American chestnut trees were dead. To this day, it remains the fastest and most complete biological collapse of a keystone food species ever recorded. Now, the explainer notes a rather chilling historical correlation regarding the timing of this collapse, keeping it neutral, but pointing out something you just can't unsee. The American chestnut died off at exactly the moment the industrialization of food was rapidly accelerating. This completely free, insanely abundant, and decentralized food source vanished at the precise historical juncture when centralized corporate food production was beginning to emerge. And think about it, that new industrial paradigm inherently required economic dependence to function. That system would be completely impossible to enforce if millions of people could just literally walk into the woods and gather all the high-quality food they needed for free. The sheer speed of the vanishing was absolutely essential for the rapid rollout of the Industrial Revolution. And if you dig into the archives, the maps completely back this up. Pre-1850 vegetation maps and regional surveys drawn up by early colonial scouts document these massive, ecologically rich landscapes that entirely contradict our modern official timeline of deforestation. They show incredibly dense forests where, according to the official record, there should have just been grassland. Interestingly, the source notes this even applies to regions historically labeled as Tartaria in Central Asia and Siberia. Maps prior to 1700 shown ecological richness and density of managed landscapes there that mysteriously just vanish from maps produced after 1800. The standard historical record really struggles to explain this sudden, massive ecological shift. But they couldn't erase absolutely everything. Physical traces actually remain today, things the source calls ghost forests. Over in England, those ancient hedgerows you see along sunken roads, they actually function as compressed planting systems. They're a linear survival of the open food forests that were forcibly pushed to the margins during the enclosures. We also see heavily restricted old growth zones out in the Pacific Northwest, with these totally anomalous concentrations of useful berries and nuts. There are protected terra preta formations deep in the Amazon. There are even Ethiopian wild coffee forests that are perfectly designed with companion shade trees. These aren't just accidents, they are the living, breathing remnants of a brilliantly designed system.
So what does this all mean? Well, it leads us to the ultimate conclusion presented by the source material. This sudden, highly coordinated clearing of global food forests, it wasn't about agricultural progress or efficiency. It was about creating what they call an architecture of dependence. It was about rapidly replacing an ancient system of free, land-based self-sufficiency with a totally new model, one where, just to survive, you absolutely must purchase seeds, rent land, and sell your labor. And that erasure had to be incredibly swift, because let's face it, independent, perfectly well-fed populations don't exactly willingly walk away from their forests to go toil inside factories. Which leaves us with one incredibly profound and frankly haunting final question from this explainer. If a highly efficient, perfectly decentralized, and virtually free global food system was deliberately dismantled across every single continent in the span of just one human lifetime, who actually benefits when people cannot feed themselves? It's a question that completely reframes our entire understanding of modern agriculture and the world that was built to replace the forests. Definitely makes you want to keep digging into the history right beneath your feet.